Are you beyond repair? Brother Thompson, we have a new brother who would like to be a part of this congregation. Shall we welcome him? In our minds we say that would be real nice to have a new brother. But he says, before you answer, let me tell you a little something about myself. He says I'm a very impetuous, impulsive individual. In fact, he says, I really talk too much. I say things before I think. Because of it I've been in a little trouble, you know, with some of the higher-ups in the organization. I've been counseled about it, too. Really, I suffer from the hoof-and-mouth disease. Well, he says, can I settle down in your congregation? You say, well, brother, I don't know. You know it, I'll tell you what, I believe the Monroe congregation could use you better than the West Monroe congregation. The reason why I tell you this is because the Monroe congregation is already full of folks who have a hoof-and-mouth disease. Do you know who you just sent to the Monroe congregation? You just sent Brother Peter. I have just given you a Bible description of Peter. That's who we have sent to Monroe. There's not a congregation on the earth, using the expression, that would not give their right arm to help Peter in our congregation. But that's who we sent over there. This is what the Bible says about Peter. Now of all the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus Christ, Peter was by far the most colorful, wasn't he, from your readings of the Bible? In fact, he was very warm-hearted, impulsive, frank, and very outspoken on occasion. But, you know, we cannot help but to love Peter because it is so easy to put ourselves in his place. To varying degrees, you and I suffer from that same problem that our brother Peter experienced. That helps us then to really feel for him. Today, we're going to talk about the problems Peter had that brought him sorrow and the parts of him that brought him a lot of joy. We're not going to make fun of Peter in any way because it's all in here, the things we're going to read. It's for a purpose. Some of us, sometimes, we get ourselves into trouble on various occasions as Peter did. But Peter never did give up. Peter hung in there. The same is true of us, so the title of the talk, Are We Beyond Repair? As we mentioned, Peter was a man quick to act. Quick to speak his thoughts. Quick to act out his feelings. That sounds just like us. It helps us to appreciate Peter even more, since we, too, probably have some of those problems. Because of his emotional nature, as we have already mentioned, he would readily go from one extreme to the other. One time feeling extreme feelings of sorrow, then on the other hand, feeling extreme feelings of joy. Let us first look at some of his actions which caused him sorrow. We do this to use him as a guide to the extreme that you and I want to avoid as we contemplate how his conduct turns out. Peter's impulsiveness caused him to contradict Jesus Christ. Turn your Bibles, if you would, to Matthew, chapter 16. Let's read this occasion. Matthew, chapter 16, beginning with verse 21. From that time forward, Jesus Christ commenced showing his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the older men and chief priests, scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised up. At this, Peter took him aside and commenced rebuking Jesus Christ. A rebuke means a sharp reproof or reprimand. So, this is what Peter was doing to Jesus, saying, "Be kind to yourself, Lord, you will not have this destiny at all." Jesus had just said, "I will have this destiny." Peter says, "You won't." "Yes, I will." "No, you won't." It could have gotten into something like that, but Jesus put an end to that, as it goes on in verse 23. But, turning his back, he said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me, because you think, not God's thoughts but those of men." Can you imagine? Now, Peter was a warm-hearted individual. He wasn't a man who meant these things, he just spoke before he thought about it. Hasn't that been our problem? We think after we've said something, and then it's too late. So, this is what happened. Can you imagine how this must have crushed Peter? He loved Jesus Christ very much. For Jesus to turn his back to him saying, "Satan, get back there. You don't speak God's thoughts. You're speaking the thoughts of man." That's one occasion that brought Peter a lot of sorrow because of what he said. Turn to John, chapter 13, and let's read another occasion. This is the occasion of the celebrating the Passover for the last time, if you remember. After they had celebrated that and were going to celebrate the memorial of Jesus' death, we find let's see, that's John, chapter 13 and verse 4. Now, you notice that after they had done that, before they had begun the second meal, because Judas was still there, Verse 4, it says, talking about Jesus, he got up from the evening meal and laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. So, Jesus, then, after they had celebrated the Passover, he got up, took off his outer garments, wrapped a towel around him, that made him a servant. So, then he started, as it says in verse 5, after that he put water into the basin and started to wash the feet of the disciples and to dry them off with the towel with which he was girded. And, so he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus said to him, what I'm doing you do not understand at present, but you will understand after these things. Peter said to him, you will certainly never wash my feet. Well, can you imagine anyone looking Jesus in the eye and saying, you'll never do that to me. You'll never wash my feet. But, really, it just didn't come out right, did it? We know Peter did not mean that. Just like the thing that brought us so much problems with maybe some of our brothers and sisters because of things that we say. We didn't really mean it, did we, brothers? It's that we said it before we thought, before we weighed the matter. Anyway, Jesus answered him, and said, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Jesus did this because there needed to be humble. He gave them the example himself. He, being the Son of God, got up and got a basin and started washing all of those dirty, dusty feet, including Judas, there in that upper room that night. He was teaching them humility. That they should be the way. Just look now, there were 13 men there. Usually, back there the host would do this, or have it done. He'd always have your feet washed for you. Today, people come see us. How about a glass of iced tea? Or, how about a cup of coffee? That's friendship, you know. Come in and sit a spell, let's talk a little bit. Back there they washed your feet. So, wouldn't this have been a wonderful opportunity for any one of those 12 to have shown their humility? To get down on their knees and wash the feet of all the rest. So, Jesus was giving them a lesson. In fact, if you go ahead and read verse 12-17, he goes into a little more detail about humility. There were 2 other occasions where Jesus had to get real rough with them for their not being humble. That's true that Jehovah's Witnesses do not practice this foot washing in our worship, but if you would like to test the humility of any one of Jehovah's Witnesses, including everyone in this house, ask them to wash your feet, and they'll do it to show that they are as humble as Jesus Christ. That's really an act of humility, is it not? So, although we don't practice that, we would if you'd like for us to prove to you that we are a humble people. So, it was here, in the case of Peter, that brought him sorrow. We find that Peter was easily swayed. In other words, he was often ruled by his heart instead of his head. But the outstanding time that Peter had difficulty was the denial of Jesus Christ. You notice that it is reported in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One of the very few events that is recorded by all 4 Gospels. It meant that this was so important that it kind of made headlines, didn't it, since it was recorded in all 4 Gospels there in the Bible. In Matthew, chapter 26, let's read about it. I think you'll appreciate this because we wonder sometimes about some of the things we do. Will we be forgiven? Are we beyond repair? I'm sure that Peter probably thought so on this occasion. The thing I've done is the worst thing I could ever do. I wonder if Jehovah will forgive me? Sometimes we wonder that. Beginning with verse 31, it says, Then Jesus said to them, All of you will be stumbled in connection with me on this night. He said, all of them, every one of them. In verse 33, let's see how Peter felt about this. But Peter, in answer, said to him, Although all the others are stumbled in connection with you, never will I be stumbled. As if to say, all the rest, these other 11, or these other 10, may be stumbled with you, but never will I now. You know me, Lord, I'm Peter, I really know what I'm doing and I can't stumble. Now, let's see what Jesus had to say to him, verse 34. And, no doubt Jesus was looking right in his eyeball. Jesus said to him, Truly, I say to you, Peter, on this night before a cock crows you will disown me 3 times. How many times? 3 times. Not 1 time or twice, but 3 times. What did Peter say about that? Verse 35. Even if I should have to die with you, I will by no means disown you. All the other disciples also said the same thing, because they had fallen there with Peter, kind of, did they not? So, this is what he said, Never, never would I disown you. Yet, that is what Jesus said. Before the cock crows, you'll disown me 3 times. Let's go to Luke 22:54, and let's see how it turned out. Now, this is taking up when they arrested Jesus and carried him to the high priest's house. Verse 54. Then they arrested Jesus and led him off and brought him into the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance. One Bible translation says he was following back in the shadows. That begins to tell us something about Peter already, doesn't it? He's kind of hiding out back there to keep from being recognized as being with Jesus. Verse 55. When they lit a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter was sitting in among them. Well, you can get lost in the crowd, right? In big crowds, when someone steals a purse or something, where does he go? Does he run down the sidewalk to try to get on one of the back streets? No, he just disappears into the crowd. Verse 56. But a certain servant girl saw him sitting by the fire and looking him over and said, "This man was one of them." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know him, woman." How many times is that? That's 1 time. Then it says in verse 58, and, after a short time, another person seeing him said, "You are also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I'm not." How many times is that? After about an hour intervene, a certain other man began insisting strongly, for certain, this man also was with him. In fact, he is a Galilean. But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." How many times is that? What did Jesus say? Do you remember about the cock or the rooster crowing? That you will have denied me 3 times. Remember, Peter said, "Never. I'd die first." So, the cock crow was in a sense heard around the world. Can you imagine how Peter must have felt? Here he had denied Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus had told him. How sad that must have been. Verse 60 continues. It says, "And instantly, while he was speaking, the cock crowed." While he was still saying, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about," the cock crowed. That really jolted Peter. That knocked him down spiritually, mentally, just like he had been hit with a ton of bricks when the cock crowed. But now it wouldn't have been so bad if Jesus had been 4 or 5 miles away. But now, verse 61, it says, "The Lord turned and looked upon Peter." Can you get that feeling? You sitting there in the bright fire. Over here just a few feet there was this house and the shutters were wide open, and there Jesus sat, silhouetted as it was, the fire shining on him. As soon as the cock crowed, Peter gradually looked over there and Jesus' eyes were turning toward him, looking at him right in the eyeball, as if to say, "I know you." How did Peter react to this? It goes on, it says, "And Peter recalled the utterance of the Lord when he said to him, 'Before a cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times.' And he went outside and wept bitterly. In a sense, apologizing, as it were. It really hurt him what he had done. He probably thought that now, he was beyond repair. He had committed the cardinal sin, that there was absolutely no forgiveness. Have we ever felt that way? Have we done things that we felt so sorry about and felt like we have to carry that guilt around the rest of our lives? Was Peter beyond repair? So far, we've discussed the things that brought Peter sorrow. 3 things. The Watchtower, 1963, gave enough information on his mistakes that we could talk for an hour. But we won't do Peter that way. Let's talk about the things that brought him joy. Things that we would appreciate because it brought him a lot of joy. In fact, it's very encouraging to see that these very qualities that Peter often displayed that caused him sorrow, on the other hand, brought joy. His makeup, the way he thought and the things he did. For example, when he was originally called from Galilee, do you remember, Jesus caused a miracle there. He was talking to all the crowds of people. The crowds got bigger and bigger and bigger and he was standing on the beach. In fact, he might have even began to wade out into the water a little bit. Everyone knew that Jesus was down there in front of all those people, so they were trying to get down on the front row seat, as it was. Isn't that right? So, there they were trying to get around him. The Bible says they were pressing him. He could have said, "Well, I'll tell you folks, if you would just stay where you are, I need to get into a different position to talk to you people." So, he walked up the beach just a little ways, and there was a little dock and 2 boats with people there cleaning out their nets. So he walked up on the dock and looked down on this boat here where two men were and said, "Would you let me get up on the bow of your boat and you paddle me around in front of these crowds here so I can finish my talk?" And Peter says, "Yes." It's the first time he came into a real close relationship with Jesus. So Peter said, "Yes," and he came into the boat. He rowed him around in front of the crowds. Jesus sat on the front of the boat and preached until he finished his sermon to them. Then he turned to Peter and says, "Let's go fishing." That was a no back in those days. It could have been around 12 o'clock, the heat of the day. No commercial fisherman ever went fishing in the daytime. It was always at night. Peter could have said, "Well, I tell you one thing, the guy gave a good talk but he sure doesn't know anything about fishing. But we'll carry this out anyway." So he rows out into the waters. They got ready to put the net over, and Jesus says, "No, don't put it in on that side. Throw it over here in the deep water." Authorities have said that the nets they used were nets that would drag the bottom. So, if they put them over here where it was shallow, they could drag the bottom in the surrounding area and keep the fish from scooting out from under the net. Being professional fishermen, as they were, it would be foolish to throw the net in deep water. It would be like throwing a fish hook out with no bait. Peter could have had something wise to say to him. But he threw the net over anyway and a miracle was performed out there. It was up in the heat of the day. It was the wrong place to throw the net, but he threw the net over anyway, and the thing was filled with fish to the point of bursting. They had to call to the other two back on the bank to come out and help them bring these fish in. Peter fell down and said, "Please forgive me, I'm a sinful man." As if Jesus didn't already know it. Did Jesus say, "Okay, you smart aleck. I've taken about as much of your lip as I want to take"? Is that what Jesus said? No. We know that because we would have never been forgiven for our sins if Jesus was that kind of individual. Instead he said, "Come follow me, and let's start catching men alive." Men, seamen, not fish. They abandoned the fish nets and started following Jesus Christ. About a year and a half later, Peter became a bona fide, as it were, apostle of Jesus Christ. It helps us to appreciate that his makeup that caused him problems, on the other hand brought him joy. This is a joyful thing that after he did, or said, the things he did, Jesus forgives him. Come, that's all right, come let's start fishing for men. Of course, they did that. It brought him a lot of joy. After Jesus' death and resurrection, and now we're going to John 21, we find something else taking place. Beginning with verse 2. Notice, in verse 2, it says, "There were in company Simon Peter and Thomas, he was called the twin, and Nathanael from Cana of Galilee and the sons of Zebedee and two others of his disciples." Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said, "We're also coming with you." Out they went, got aboard the boat, but during that night they caught nothing. However, just as it was getting to be morning, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not discern it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, "Young children, you do not have anything to eat, do you?" They answered, "No," to him. He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." Then they cast it, but they were no longer able to pull it in because of the multitude of fishes. What did this remind them of, do you think? Yes, that's how they could recognize that it was Jesus Christ. Imagine, they fished all night. Have you ever fished at night? In fact, even in the day. But, at night it's so still. When you're fishing on the river or lake, doesn't your voice carry? Can't you hear his words come across there, 300 feet from the beach, as it just echoed across the water, carrying the sound so well? You just hear his voice and he knows that you haven't caught anything. He says to throw the net on the other side of the boat. They did, and couldn't pull them all in. Right away, they recognized who it was. In fact, verse 7, it says, "Therefore the disciple whom Jesus used to love, John, said to Peter, 'It's the Lord.'" So, what did Peter do? Peter, upon hearing that it was the Lord, girded about himself his top garment because he was naked and plunged into the sea. Now, this is the man that suffers from the Euphemous disease. Just like a lot of us. We get our foot in our mouths sometimes. This was the kind of fellow he was. Who was first to jump off the boat? It wasn't John, the one that laid his head on the chest of Jesus and they were very, very close. It was this fellow like us. He was so glad that it was Jesus Christ, he jumped in and I can see him splashing water all over everybody. He swam full speed for 100 yards. When is the last time we did that? When he got there, he had the opportunity for quite some time to sit and talk alone with Jesus Christ. After a while, here comes John and those other brothers with that boat full of fish. They finally got up to the bank, got off, and greeted Jesus, probably. Then, they sat and talked a little bit. It says the coals were hot and there was bread that was on the coals, and so on. Peter had to go, get into the boat, pull the net up, get some fish out and fix breakfast himself. After they had breakfast, here, remember Jesus says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter said, "Why yes, Lord, I love you. Feed my fish." Is that what he said? No. He didn't say, feed his fish. He said feed his sheep, or sheep-like ones. The thought is that here when the apostle, Jesus, was killed, what did they do? Did they continue preaching? No, they went back to the fish nets, didn't they? Where Jesus had chosen them earlier to go and start catching men, not fish. The second time he asked him, "Do you have affection for me?" "Why yes, Lord, I have affection for you. Feed my sheep-like ones." The third time, "Do you love me, Peter?" "Lord, you know I do." Here he probably whizzed off at Jesus like, "I already told you twice that I do." He was that kind of individual. Here's the point, the person that had the problem among the 12, the one that had the youth disease, was the one that Jesus gave the whole responsibility to see that the good news was preached after he was gone. So, are we beyond repair? No. Jehovah forgives us. Jesus forgives us. Just like Jesus forgave Peter. Look at all the nice privileges Peter was able to enjoy that you and I can, too. Never think that we can go so far that we can't get back. We can be forgiven. None of us are beyond repair. If we apply ourselves as Peter did on the many cases that he got in trouble with Jesus Christ. In Matthew, chapter 14, we're talking now about the joys that the makeup of Peter brought him. Here in Matthew, chapter 14, we find at the time that Jesus fed the 5,000, that was just 5,000 men, not counting their wives and children, remember, with the 5 loaves and the little 2 fishes. After they had finished, it was getting late. The apostles got on the boat and Jesus says, "You all go on across the sea and I'm going to pray and I'll meet you on the other side." It was already quite late, but starting over here with verse 24. By now the boat was many hundreds of yards away from land, being hard put to it by the waves, because the wind was against them. Now they could have been 3 or 4 miles out in the center of the sea. But, in the 4th watch period of the night, that's between 3 and 4 in the morning, 3 or 4 miles out to sea, they happened to look up and they thought they saw someone in the middle of this storm walking on top of the water. Can you imagine how they must have felt when they were doing all they could to try to save the boat and their lives, and then they looked out there and thought they saw an apparition? It frightened them to death to see someone walking out there on top of the water, especially at this time. In fact, it says, when they caught sight of him walking, verse 26, on the sea, the disciples were troubled, saying, "It is an apparition," and they cried out in their fear. At once Jesus spoke to them with the words, "Take courage, it is I, have no fear." That really relaxed them, don't you imagine? But, how much did it relax our brother Peter? Well, verse 28. In reply Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you over the waters." And Jesus said, "Come on. Just come on. I've made some mistakes in my life, but I don't think I would have gotten into that one. I don't believe." But, there he was now. Jesus says come on, and you don't tell the Lord you're not going to come. There it was, a storm, walking on the sea, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and he says, "Come on." Peter probably wished he'd never opened his mouth, just like we have wished we had never opened our mouth when we did whatever it was that severed the relationship between us and some of our brothers. It probably will never be exactly the same. Now, Peter could have said as he stood on the edge of the boat with John sitting there, the waves hitting, the wind and the water splashing and flopping everywhere. Peter could have said, "John, oh John," what did he say? Hoping John would say, "I didn't hear a thing, Peter." Then it would have been better. John could have said, "Well, Peter, if I've told you one time, my brother, I've told you 10,000 times that one of these days that little thing there is going to get you into a heap of bad trouble." But, whatever went on, John could have said, "You'd better get out." He said, "Get out. Go." So then Peter, now, here's the way I would have done that, I believe. I would have gotten on the edge of that boat. Why yes, I've got faith, but just in case, you know, and I would get on the edge of that boat and take one foot and stick it outside and put it down in the water and pushed on it to be sure it's going to stay. Then I'd take this other foot and put it down right by that first one, because whatever that foot was on, I'd want the other foot to get on it too. So there I stood, holding onto the boat, you know, just in case. Wind blowing, Jesus still out there, so finally John says, "You had better turn this boat loose." I'd turn that boat loose, and here I stand right in the water in a storm. The other brother's eyes in the boat are about that big around, about to pop out looking at me. Rather, Peter, I wasn't really out there. There I'd be, see, and just like me, I got out facing the wrong direction and I'm scared to move. Anyway, Peter turned and started walking across the water. He had faith, but we wonder if he did. Verse 29, it says, "Thereupon, Peter, getting down off the boat, walked over the waters and went toward Jesus. But, looking at the windstorm, he got afraid and, after starting to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" So, here he was. I can't really imagine Peter being out there sharing in a miracle with Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and getting all concerned about the weather. To the extent he got so worried about the weather that he sank. But, it happened, he just got that close to Jesus that they almost met because Jesus stuck his hand down to get him. Can you picture Peter saying, "Oh, I don't want your hand, Jesus, I can swim. I've been fishing now for 35, 40 years, or whatever it was. I've been overboard 150 times, I don't need you to help me swim. You go on over and get in the boat, I'll swim over there." Can you picture Peter doing that? Sometimes when we have a problem, a spiritual or maybe other problem, a lot of times we quit going to the meetings. The elders, out of love for you, they come to visit us. They try to help us get back and become strong and enjoy the fellowship of our brothers and sisters and everything that comes with it. Sometimes the elders go out and stick out a helping hand to those, and you know what those folks say. "We don't need you out here. We know where the kingdom hall is, I've had them tell me, and when we get ready, we'll come." Can you picture anybody doing that? That would be the same as Peter saying, "Lord, I don't need you. I can swim by myself. I know where the boat is, and when I get ready, I'll come to the boat. And you're drowning out here. Just like we're drowning at home spiritually, drowning to death. Then when the brothers come out of love to help us, you know where the kingdom hall is, brother elder, and when we get ready to come, we'll come. But, you're still not beyond repair." That didn't really happen to Peter. Peter didn't really do that. Some of our brothers and sisters do. Peter probably reached up and grabbed that hand with all force. "Yes, sir, I want you to help me up." Jesus helped him up and they went and got in that boat. He accepted his assistance. Peter could have said, knowing him like we do, he could have said, "Brothers, I know I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble," as he's talking to these folks in the boat. "I've gotten in a lot of trouble in my life, but I'll tell you one thing, there's only two people that have walked on water." He could have said that. Me and Jesus Christ. It brought him joy that he was able to get out there and walk on the water with the Son of God. We, too, can enjoy the peace and contentment that comes with serving Jehovah and doing his will. So Peter, by his many names, Simon, Simon Peter, Cephas is mentioned in the inspired record more than all the other 11 combined. When Peter is named with any other apostle, you'll find that his name is always first. Peter's initiative was one that did not let him wait for someone else to step in and do his job. Peter was a man who had initiative, and he would do the work that was assigned him and would not leave it, or kind of goof off so that someone else would do it for him. We can all learn, can we not, from Peter? Although he had problems like we do. It's important then that we imitate this side of Peter. As forward as Peter was because of his impulsive nature, his zeal, he was not designingly ambitious. Remember James and John went to Jesus, with their mother, wanting a special seat in the kingdom. Peter was not one of those individuals. When Paul came on the picture, Peter didn't get mad because he had been in charge so long and here comes someone else to shoot him out of saddle, as they say. No, sir, he just went right on his way. Paul took over and everything turned out well. After that, there wasn't much else we heard about Peter anymore. He was in a body of elders. He was in Jerusalem when they had a case or two there. The Bible indicates that he made some missionary tour after that. He just faded away. He realized that that's the way it was because someone else had better qualifications. Someone else for the work that had to be done would be the one. In this case, it was the Apostle Paul. As we briefly covered Peter's life to some extent, we can see that he began to mellow. He began to change. You'll find that in the Bible the book that dealt the most severest with his problems was Mark. It's the book he himself dictated while Mark wrote it down. We find that Peter, sometimes in reading his two books you'll find that it doesn't sound like the same person we were just talking about. Because as he lived he took advantage of the counsel he received, left his mistakes, which moved him to do better. His two books, 1st and 2nd Peter, again you'd never think it was the same person we've been talking about, would you? He took advantage of the counsel he received, worked hard not to make the same mistake twice, praying to Jehovah, I'm sure, and Jehovah surely did bless him for his efforts. Read his two books and you'll enjoy very much being able to read about a man that we might have thought in the beginning, in fact he might have thought himself, that he was beyond repair. That being the case with him, surely that's the case with us. Neither are we beyond repair.